you, all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret.
Uh-huh. Ooh, good morning. Well, it's not morning. We're at noon, so it's not, but I want to say good day to all of you who are dialing in and welcome to today's Center for Studies in Higher Education webinar focused on international education. As you know, all of the CSAG webinars invite research experts on strategic issues in higher education. But of course, CSAG also conducts research and publicizes good research in many other different ways. So thank you for joining us, and be sure join us in other mechanisms, other means also. Now, today, we will hear from three outstanding speakers who have just published this excellent book on international education. And you'll see it is titled Mestenhauser and the Possibilities of International Education. And I'm going to give you a little content of it. It focuses on through a series of provocative essays, the contributor to this volume examined Mestenhauer's influence on their understanding and practice of international education. And the book addresses the theoretical foundations of the field of international education and the implications for practice and strategy. So it's a very, very useful book for conducting international education. Focusing on Mestenhauser, some of you, I'm sure, know he was a leading figure in international education for many, many years. And the book reveals and assesses frameworks for educating students regarding diverse cultures, both globally and nationally. And it relates the benefit of knowledge of diverse cultures, which of course is terribly important. Okay, our three speakers today are Anne D'Angelo. She is Assistant Dean of Global Initiatives at the University of Minnesota Carlson School of Management. And as you may know, Mestenhauser was the leading figure in international education at the University of Minnesota. Moving to the second speaker, it is Mary Catherine O'Brien, researcher for education and outreach at the University of Minnesota College of Veterinary Medicine. And finally, Gayla Marty, higher education writer and editor. Now, when these three speakers complete their initial presentations, they will then respond to questions you may have raised upon registration for this webinar, and any question you raise on your computer screen throughout the lectures. Now, we're going to hear from our very first speaker, Mary Catherine O'Brien. Mary Catherine, please begin.
Mary Catherine. Thank you so much, Margaret. I really appreciate it. And of course, we want to extend our thanks to the Center for Studies in Higher Education for inviting us and supporting us on the path
Bring you
of
this book again.
preparing the talk. Yeah, thank you so much. Of course, we also want to welcome everyone that's on the call today for being here, especially if you are rejoining us. This is a sort of a redo of a presentation. So hopefully things go smoothly today and we can spend our time talking about Joe Mestenhauser. So you can see Joe here on this slide right here. Dr. Joseph Mestenhauser was a giant in the field of international education, but he always insisted that everybody in his orbit called him Joe. And so we will today in this presentation. I think the informal in this case is actually the sign of respect. So you can see Joe's picture here. This is taken in 1992 in the Czech Republic when Joe returned to receive his law degree from Charles University, which was more than 40 years after he had been forced out of what was then Czechoslovakia, been pushed out of that degree program, imprisoned, and then escaped. And so the time that we met Joe and had the opportunity to work with him was here. His path brought him through Europe into actually the Western United States, and then to the University of Minnesota here in the middle of the United States, where the three of us had the opportunity to meet with him and work with him, write with him. And that is the basis. That relationship is really the basis of the book that Margaret has held up here for all of you. And I am trying to advance my slides. Here we go. So this is the volume that was published by Routledge last year, really with the visionary guidance and the support of Elspeth Jones there, who is the series editor for this Internationalization in Higher Education series. I'm sure many of you are familiar with that. It's an edited volume, and I'll talk a little bit here at the beginning of how that came to be, but Anne and I really had the opportunity to work with Joe on what is now the central chapter and section of this volume, which is Joe's last work that's been brought to publication. And Anne and I, through our work at the university and as graduate students and then as staff, had the opportunity to work frequently and edit Joe's work, to talk to him. He loved working with people who were studying international education and working on the practice side. So we both had been working on this project with him when he passed in 2015. And his goal had been to bring this to publication. And we are so extraordinarily grateful to the Mestenhauser family who agreed that we could keep going with the project. Knowing that we didn't have enough text to put a full volume together, where the project stood at Joe's passing, we started to talk about an edited volume and having people be able to reflect on Joe's work and sort of situate what those ideas were into the present day and the varying roles that they played. So Elspeth's vision for this book was really that it would be a refresher of Joe's ideas for people who were working in the field, in the various roles that are central to international education, and that it would really expose a new generation of scholars and practitioners to Joe's theories, concepts, and mindset, really. So I think with our limited time today, that's really what we're going to be able to do as well. The complexity of what's here is pretty tremendous. So we've organized the talk today. There'll be a section giving you a bit of history on Joe's life. Gayla will do that. And then Anne's going to talk a little bit about the guiding, the centrality of systems theory to Joe's work, because that really, I think for those of us who are working in the higher education space and these contributing authors who were a part of this project, for all of us, this is really one of the components that has a lot of impact and a lot of potential for the teaching and the research that we're doing on campus. And those of you who are also potentially in international education adjacent roles, that you may not be situated at the university, but certainly contributing to the broader mechanisms of international education and exchange. Here are our 24 contributors that are noted here. There are at least 9 countries of origin of individuals who wrote chapters or co-authored chapters. They're based currently in 6 different countries around the globe and on 5 continents. So I think the coverage is truly a reflection of Joe's reach as a mentor and a scholar, and his ability to inspire people around the world and in wildly different generations to keep moving forward with the tradition of international education in a theory-based way. I am going to take 1 second and put a plug in, given that we can't, of course, cover the complexity of all that's coming through in the volume. I would encourage you to purchase the book. And the reason that it's easy for me to make that case for you, all of the proceeds for this book benefit the Mestenhauser Legacy Initiative at the University of Minnesota, which focuses on primarily facilitating cross-cultural exchange among students on campus, and then also building student leadership competency for domestic students, international students, students who are thriving in sort of the current conversations on the DEI space and things like that. So it's really instrumental and important work that this book ultimately seeks to also support. So in the beginning, we're gonna do 2 things, and one, I think, just another nod. It's important to tend a bit to how Joe defined and saw international education, and then to tend to who Joe was as a person. I'll start. Oh gosh, I'm so sorry. I will start here with the component that is sort of how Joe saw the field, and he often wrote of it as a supra discipline that was spanning the entire system of higher education. And that's going to frame a lot of Anne's comments today. How Joe really saw the opportunity to push forward integration and differentiation between the parts of that system, including teaching and research. And that harkens back to the title of the talk that we've organized here for you today. So, we were able to, I think, really tend to all of those components of the system through soliciting these chapters from people in wildly different roles, very different geographies, different stages of their careers. And again, I encourage you to sort of take that dive into the volume itself, because it's really important to us that while Joe had his own definitions of international education and the ways of characterizing the system, every author who participated in the volume, true to form and true to Joe's vision, really brought that as well. So that nuance, I think, is a really important characterization of the international education realm, and also all of the individuals who are working in it. So with that sort of drawing this introduction to the close, I think the next important piece is to bring a bit of Joe's personal history, and I will pass to Gayla to do that.
Hi. Thank you, Mary Catherine, very much. I had the real fortune to work with Joe Mestenhauser for the first decade of my career in communications in the 80s and into the 90s. And little by little, I learned the outline of the life behind his vision, and he learned to tell his story. Because in the beginning, he didn't really talk about his own story. Joe Mestenhauser was born in 1925 in what was then Czechoslovakia, the young nation created after independence from Austria. His first career aspiration was entering the Foreign Service for his home country. But of course, World War II intervened. His family bravely resisted German occupation and survived. And after the war, Joseph studied law at Charles University in Prague, and this is his student ID. In slide 5, the next slide, Joe had a very powerful personal story. As a student activist protesting the communist takeover in 1948, and shortly before receiving his law degree, he was arrested. He escaped jail with a broken hip and fled. He was tried in absentia and knew then that he could never return. He became a Cold War emigre from Prague. And this is his ID from that time, moving to the UK and then to the US first at the University of Eastern Washington. His leg had healed by then, and he taught skiing to support his studies and met his future wife. And they came to the University of Minnesota for graduate. He came for graduate study in political science. But before 1991, he rarely spoke of his early life. The next slide, you'll see Joe in the 1950s. He entered the field of higher education in 1951. He was then newly married, a grad student, and the University of Minnesota has recently created Foreign Student Advisors Office, working for a veteran who recognized Joe's talents. And Joe, as Mary Catherine mentioned, insisted that everyone call him Joe, and he'd really started over. Joe lived and led his life dedicated to new knowledge development and practice in international education with a key concept, culture. He really focused on that, and with students at the core. He brought great empathy to his work with any students who left their own country and culture for another for whatever reason. This photo ran in the Minnesota Daily student newspaper in 1959. His life included many leadership roles, first, of course, as a student leader in Czechoslovakia, and then in his refugee camp, then as an innovative graduate assistant and administrator that you see in this photo. For example, in 1952, he led in creating a bilateral exchange with the Free University of Berlin that became a group of exchanges with universities on 5 continents, governed by a board of the students from those countries in any given year, along with the Minnesota students returned from those countries. And I met Joe in 1980 after returning home from a year in Tunisia on that exchange program, but I didn't know until many years later that he had helped to create it. I served on the board with students from and returned from Germany, Norway, Hungary, Tunisia, Tanzania, Uruguay, and Malaysia. It was an amazing mechanism for student development and a great example of what he called the university as a living laboratory. So Joe led as a scholar, reading voraciously. He was always pushing people, suggesting things that we should be reading, advocating for and conducting international research, and developing theories drawn from many fields. He received Fulbright Awards for teaching and research in Japan, Korea, and Philippines in 1963, a full year in the Philippines in 1966-67, Japan for 6 months in 1980, and the Czech Republic in 1991-92. He led the Foreign Student Advisors Office as interim director, then associate director, and then director, as it was renamed and evolved toward what is currently the Global Programs and Strategy Alliance at the University of Minnesota. He led in his role as a professor and was a pivotal force in establishing the PhD in Comparative and International Development Education at the University of Minnesota. So Joe lived the transition of international education from the Division of Student Affairs to Academic Affairs, serving his last decades in the classroom and on the faculty of the College of Education and Human Development, and really thrived on that, working with grad students, PhD students on the research that and pushing the research forward. He was a mentor, not only to U of M faculty, staff, and students, but to anyone who was willing to engage. He was thrusting and trusting them into leadership roles too. And he led in developing the profession beyond what he called a bunch of good guys in the early days. Most notably, he was one of the presidents of NAFSA, Association of International Educators. The next slide, slide 7, Joe was a diplomat too. Running for a seat in the Czechoslovak government in 1948 was just the very first manifestation. Years later, his eagerness to go to the Minnesota State Legislature to advocate for international students reflected that orientation and passion. He was co-founder of Minnesota's World Affairs Council, later called the Minnesota International Center, and then Global Minnesota. It was after Czechoslovakia reopened that Joe accepted the appointment of Honorary Consul General of the Czech and Slovak republics in the Midwest when this portrait was taken. With that, unimaginably, he realized his very earliest career aspiration. But perhaps most significantly, he was a scholar practitioner, always thinking about the public diplomacy and public affairs aspects of international education. The public research university was really a match for his vision and his temperament. And he was reading, thinking, and writing in that vein up until the last weeks of his life in 2015 when he generated the manuscript at the heart of this book. His was a very complex and interesting career. And with that, I will hand it off to my colleague Anne D'Angelo. Thank you.
Thanks, Gayla. This is an excellent illustration of Joe putting his theory into action and using a systems lens to do so. He intentionally created space to convene an array of people to discuss, debate, and reframe theories, concepts, and action in international education. He experimented with applying different frameworks such as Bowman and Deal, intentionally examining a challenge or an issue in the field from a particular frame, a structural frame, a human resources frame, a political frame, a symbolic or cultural frame, to name a few. And the complexity of this task, Joe believed, called for a systems approach. He often relied on Peter Senge's definition of systems thinking. And I'd like to just read from the text here with that definition. Systems thinking as a discipline of seeing wholes, WHOLES. It is a framework for seeing interrelationships rather than things, for seeing patterns of change rather than static snapshots. It is a set of principles. It is also a set of specific tools and techniques that have been applied to understand a wide range of systems. Next slide. Joe focused on systems theory concepts that he found to be particularly applicable to international education. He argues that two principal ways to employ systems thinking are differentiation, the ability to identify the parts and the relationships among them and between them and the whole, and integration, the recognition of how these parts connect with each other and the meaning of their connections in theory and in practice. Applying systems theory allows international educators to recognize the parts and the whole of our work and encourages us to freely move between the two. A significant barrier to achieving this is that our higher education leaders often misunderstand or completely ignore the whole, continuing to focus on the transactional parts of international education in their rhetoric and agendas, which further fragments the field and disregards the impact of interrelationships on the entire system. And we're divided by various administrative and instructional units, reporting to various structures and fluctuating in emphasis from process to product learning. And we believe increasing complacency emerges in large part from the fatigue of navigating these fragmented parts of the system. Now I want to send this back to Mary Catherine. I think you're muted, Mary Catherine.
I am. Thank you. It's 2024. You wouldn't know I've been using this tool for 5 years yet. But with I think that one of the challenges, this opportunity came to us because we had these tremendous conversations with Joe as students and colleagues about systems approaches to the work and the ability to celebrate and be able to honor the differentiation of all of the components of the work, but also with an eye to really artful integration. And I think that was something that Joe brought. But even the systems literature that we've all read and integrated into our own scholarship doesn't always do a fantastic job of giving guidance with a particular field of how to be a better systems operator. And I think that it's something that's frequently very overwhelming. And one of the things that came out of, we have a colleague here at the University of Minnesota, Barbara Kapler-Mick, who is the Associate Dean of International Student and Scholar Services here on campus. and had worked as a graduate student with Joe for a very long time. And she writes in her chapter this, I could sense that he was reaching out to me enthusiastically, offering words as if he was offer, offering words as if he were serving me a full course lunch with coffee and dessert, like in the way that he would reach out and encourage the use of systems and read more on systems theory and integrate all of these approaches into your work. And she admits in her chapter, she said, he seemed to sense that I was full at appetizers. And I think it's so true for those of us who balance an academic role and then an administrative role as well, particularly, speaking from my own experience, that the idea of operating from a systems approach is really nice on paper. The reality of being able to carry that through is really quite exhausting, and I think Anne's right that the fatigue stems from also maybe being one of the lone entities who's really committed to that and having others that are operating more within the comfort of their silo and knowing their policies, procedures, knowing their area of expertise, but not necessarily making the key connections. So one of the opportunities we saw with the volume, and Anne and I co-authored the concluding chapter, was to really look across not just Joe's work, but also to look across the varying chapters, all of the individuals who had written around essentially these differing components of the system, and look for some of those integrating opportunities as well, and to think about this tension of differentiation and integration and thinking about, but what does that really mean for daily work? And so stemming from Joe's chapter and a number of conversations with him, we framed these as the calls to action. And I hope that, the clarity comes through that these are ones that we're qualitative researchers for the most part. The idea of looking across the text for patterns and what had resonated with the other authors, and what also felt to us that were really sort of present and relevant for the current challenges of the field. So in a way, it's your appetizer. I hope if you're not extraordinarily familiar with systems approach within the field of international education, you will first look to Joe's work, because I think that is without a doubt an extraordinary starting place. But here are some of those themes that came through for us. One, in sort of our first call to action, is to lead for the future and not just for the present. And I think that sounds really intuitive until you stare down that full inbox and you're dealing with a staff issue, you're attending a crisis management meeting, and it becomes a bit more aspirational. And I think what we found resonating with people from Joe's work was his lived commitment to doing this and his focus on leadership as a concept and then also as a process. Thinking about how leadership can be distributed across organizations, how we can ensure that students are stepping into leadership positions within their own development. And Joe brought such a deep interest in the sort of the leadership competencies and the school of thought of what it means to be a leader and the impact of the cultures that really end up influencing the style of what we bring forward, and not just national and ethnic cultures, but also disciplinary cultures, professional cultures, and what that means for how we move forward. So in the chapter, we identified 4, and looking across sort of the other contributions, there were 4 themes that came up that we saw repeatedly. What does it mean to lead for the future and not the present? Supporting the shift from hierarchical to distributed leadership. I already sort of mentioned that, but where in our own environments that's possible, trying to encourage others, holding ourselves, our peers, and staff members to high expectations. And I think we all saw, particularly just the difficulties of the last few years, the pandemic bearing down there were days it was easy to not to only be in survival mode. And there are, of course, there are times, but I would always hear Joe's voice too, pushing me to know it wasn't sufficient. It was okay for a day or two, but it wasn't a sufficient overarching approach. A willingness to try a systems approach, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that next. And then adopting a more intentional, strategic, and future-oriented approach, and really planning for a future that we don't even know, but being open to what that process looks like and what that can be. With this willingness to try a systems approach and to encourage others to do the same, regardless of success, I think it bears a little bit of mentioning here. But this, in our own experience, but also in the experience of our co-authors, this really demands a mindset shift and, importantly, a culture of failing forward. And there's a value that brings that is simply disregarded almost exclusively, I think, by the current culture of evaluation in the university environment. And we spend a lot of time amongst ourselves talking about this, that the rigidity of setting targets and measuring outcomes, you think about, let's take an example of student mobility, only counting student numbers and only working to get those numbers. It really just puts a pressure on the system that doesn't give it enough oxygen to thrive. And so I think that as educators, we also carry this tremendous responsibility of changing the culture of evaluation in our work and helping others to understand that the complexity of the field really demands a complexity of approach. And if we want to keep growing, as professionals, we want to really have this international education community that's inclusive of students, it's inclusive of peer relations around the globe. It is simply going to look different than maybe what our administrators and some of our other colleagues immediately understand as progress or success. And so what work does that demand of us to put into effect this call to action? The second is this shift away from dualistic thinking and exploring myriad mindsets. And I think that this is frequently characterized, and we did as well, more both and less either or. And I think that is particularly at the present moment and so many conversations that are taking place on campuses. This is a difficult place at times to stand in that. And to say, no, I see a value, right? I see a value in working across difference and working across difference of opinions and making higher education that space where agreement isn't necessarily the goal, but giving space for ourselves to practice this differentiation and integration of ideas is extraordinarily important. One of the chapter authors, Yulia Kartoshkina, who is also a colleague of ours at the University of Minnesota, her chapter really stems out of a shared interest that she had with Joe in neuroscience and culture learning. And she does an exploration from a neuroscience-informed approach about how our experiences and our culture inform our beliefs and our positions, where to this point, where literally, physiologically and chemically, we have a comfort zone. And that is a shared, almost human condition. And that the only way to do that is to shift that out of our comfort zone, to be able to take multiple perspectives, is through deep intentionality, through those critical conversations, those tough conversations, examining other viewpoints, and using higher education as the fulcrum and the catalyst to do that and teach people how to do it respectfully, I think is something that is of paramount importance right now. The third, I think, call to action that we pulled is intentionally including a greater diversity of people and ideas. And I think here Anne and I were really responding to a lot of the activity that we had seen. Of course, we were writing this volume from Minneapolis. We on our campus were daily dealing with all of the impact of the murder of George Floyd in our community and what that was doing to reshape classrooms. And we were seeing a lot of superficial inclusion, a lot of opportunities to bring people together. But it's not just that that happens, you know, the need to really scaffold that, to get to know people on an individual level, understanding their goals, their lived experiences, and really bringing people about in a meaningful inclusion, to have the hard conversations rather than necessarily coming up immediately with solutions, right? Letting that a sort of a different cultural approach take hold, and thinking about the ways that we are convening ourselves. In a slightly different space, again, in the volume, we had Shenton Chang and Kat Gomez from Australia writing about their experience in digital platforms, and how right now with the internet exploding, and of course post-COVID pandemic, it being everywhere in education as a modality of learning. But there's a deep assumption that we're all part of this global platform and it is international. But the reality is that, you know, we're all bringing a different cultural lens to what we're seeing and how we're understanding things. And through that chapter, you see that more broadly, they're really making this argument that barriers to access and participation exist. And in large part, if you are trying to move forward a type of cultural learning, a type of collaborative activity in your work, really the role of intentionally designing behind that action, what you really think the nature of the relationship, and giving the group the opportunity to set some of that course for themselves as well. This is a place where, of course, if you are familiar with Joe Mestenhauser and you know that the other think radical inclusion for him, and for some of us this feels radical and for others it doesn't, but he was the biggest champion of bringing students to every realm of the university, bringing students to the state legislature, really making sure that the voices of students are elevated, that their needs were understood, and that their expertise was really harnessed in a lot of the teaching and the research, the practice that we carry forward. And I can say, honestly, I work in a center within the College of Veterinary Medicine. And it is rare that I see, outside of the work that we do, it's rare that I see vet students, right? The idea that they're sort of just a group of people that are being trained in the classrooms versus making decisions of how the college functions, that is something that would have hit Joe in really the wrong way. And his elevation of their status benefited so many people. Here he is with recipients of the Mestenhauser Student Leadership Award here at the university, probably 2013. And I know we're running short on time, so I will fast forward here to the last one. But the last call to action that Anne and I brought forward is always start with theory, and this is one of Joe's passion. And his quote here is, "I'm concerned that the multitude of activities in international education lack a theoretical foundation." And I think those of us who maybe have been engaged in the practice side of the field, student mobility areas particularly, you do often see that again, it's a numbers game or it's a business model. And Joe would have advocated that you are looking actually at these students moving around as part of the teaching, learning, and research agenda of the institution, the intercultural and cross-cultural learning opportunity, the global citizenship development. And I think that it's not common that those conversations are necessarily taking place. And so for him to really bring this was paramount, to bring this idea forward, because I think we can get lazy. And one of the sort of concrete ways that he manifested this is always referring, higher education as a living laboratory. What is happening here that we can use to better understand these dynamics? With that, I think it's time for you to stop listening to me and for us to entertain a few questions. But I hope that gives you a sense of why we found Joe's work, for him as a person, this life story, the way he integrated that into the fabric of his own work and his own relationships on campus, how he impacted this global community of scholars and practitioners. And then sort of where we take this, and Anne always says, and it's true, like now the hard work begins, right? Just examining the ideas isn't necessarily going to be sufficient. What we aim to do is to now think about how in our own roles, and then in conversation with others about the field more broadly, like where does this go? And so I think we're hoping to use the remaining time today to be in dialogue with all of you and to address some of the questions that may come up.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, I'm going to raise a few questions now. Thank you very much for letting us know so much about the leadership that Meston Hauser exercised. First, I want to ask one that says, Meston Hauser advanced the goal of cultural learning in international education to be of very high value. Can you give us some examples of this? And I think that's a very important question. Cultural learning.
Sure. I can dig in, and then I can give like a little bit of sort of throw the ball to my colleagues, but I have a very specific example, and one that one of the things that we kept hearing from these co-authors as we did the project was just honestly how surprised people were at how relevant work that Joe did in the 1960s, the 1970s, his future orientation, his ability to write really far outpaced, I think, the general cultural competence at the time, or the sense that was important necessarily. And I can speak, when I wrote my dissertation, I used what is outdatedly titled, but Joe was really involved in writing the Learning with Foreign Students curriculum about how international students are really overlooked as a learning resource in our interactions, whether it's a lab setting, a classroom setting. And he presents some strategies for bringing out the really authentic cross-cultural learning, discussion prompts, ways of really building mutual respect among students and student groups in a way that if you read it, I really would have thought it was written in the 2010s, not, I think the date on one of those 1972, and the I think the importance that he was placing already on the value of culture was absolutely tremendous. The other example that really comes to mind is culture at the core. And Anne, would you be willing to, or Gayla, does somebody want to talk a little bit about the culture at the core part of his scholarship?
Go ahead, Anne.
Oh, well, in thinking about culture, I think that one key thing that he always asked about in any conversation or interaction was, what is the culture that's at the core of this conversation? So that could be personal culture. Who are we? And how are we coming to this conversation? The culture of our organizations. I work in a business school at the University of Minnesota, which is unlike where I teach in the College of Education and Human Development and where my degrees are from. So even the different disciplines and the different silos that exist, there are various cultures that exist. We always tend to go towards the different cultures from various geographies and that sort of thing, but it's so much more than that. And so it's really asking the question about who we are, who is around the table, and how do we navigate that difference and really embrace it. Joe really believed that divergent ideas and perspectives increase inclusivity and impact, and he lived his life that way. And so although he didn't use the words diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, justice, he lived his life that way. He convened people in that way. And the debates and discussions that we had and the output of that really is indicative of the chapters in this book. We were as co-editors, we were so surprised how these what seemed to be simple concepts of culture, how various people interpreted it and interpreted the other concepts and theories, and how they implemented them in their own environments, their own cultures. So that's a little bit about my perspective about it. Did I miss anything, Gail or MK?
Well, I think that's really good. And I could add to, some of my conversations with Joe, for example, I did some of my research on the difference between rural and urban cultures within the United States. And I had a real interest in that. And he immediately connected me to some writing of one of his Japanese colleagues um, that was on the same topic that really helped inform my research. And it was interesting because Joe was very skeptical initially. He just thought of American culture, and he challenged me to think about like how is rural and urban different cultures within the United States, and it really helped us both to move along in our thinking and develop some nuance to those the idea of culture. And then another thing that I really witnessed in our office culture was the way in which he wanted to hire people from different, not just from different areas of the world, but from different areas of the United States and different cultures within the United States to bring their perspectives to bear. And it made for some long staff meetings sometimes, but it was really fascinating because we really learned a lot about each other. Um, and and then that was building relationships that allowed us then to have more productive um, and I think efficient and innovative working relationships in the various tasks that we worked on for the office.
And I would just close out one of the quotes that I think came out. A few authors pulled this in their chapters, but I think it's worthy of reading, just given the question and the conversation. But Joe had written in 2011, culture is not only the major variable of how we should understand other countries, but how our own culture influences what we know about them as well. In other words, while culture is something we cherish, protect, and celebrate, it is also a mental box that encloses and screens other pieces of learning and potentially distorts them. And so I think in that way too, now we tend to talk about culture, honestly, and I'm going to pull from another former late University of Minnesota colleague, Dr. Michael Page, but he would always say the Feast of Nations version of culture, right? Where you go over here and you experience Japan, and you go over here and you experience Turkey. That is such a surface level understanding of culture, and that Joe is saying it is a tremendous sense of who we are, and that is a bi-directional and almost a responsibility that we carry to be able to acknowledge that it is again a system of interacting parts, and every perception we have of somebody else's differences are rooted really in our own. And I think that those dimensions of his writing really get into, as Anne said, he's moving that theory often in his writing into other dimensions of professional culture and disciplinary culture.
Well, I just one other thing I want to add is later in my career when I was working with our Institute of Child Development and the College of Education, we have a really top-ranked Institute of Child Development doing research on genetics and epigenetics levels and so forth. And it was very clear to me in looking at some of the research that was being done there, especially when it's done by people from different cultures coming into that Institute of Child Development, that we can see how culture is literally wiring us differently from the time we are infants and learning how, what is normal, what is, and just the computational learning in our brains of the frequency of occurrences and what happens next. And so I think that Joe would have been really interested in that if he'd had more exposure to really some of the cutting edge research that that is being done now with the tools that we have.
Thank you very much. Good answers. Now, I have to say, your answers to that first question do have some important implications for the second one, but I'm going to raise it. And if you have anything to add, please do. Otherwise, we'll go on to the next question. Question 2 is, I am not familiar with Mestenhauser, this person wrote. Are aspects of the values of diversity, equity, access, inclusion, and belonging involved?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, I think Anne hit the nail on the head a bit earlier when she said those were not the words that Joe used, but they were the way he ran his classrooms, the way he managed his staff, the way he brought radical inclusion into all of the areas that he touched. And I think that I benefited from that. I would sit down and talk to him about my research, right? And who was I? Really no one, still no one, but he did not perceive it that way. And the confidence that I had from those interactions have just been foundational, and so instructive of how we should be with others. One of the stories that comes out of the book, and people really dug into the scholarship, but I think one really nice aspect of these chapters, people brought personal stories if they had them. And one of them comes from Miki Horie, who is based in Japan at Ritsumeikan, at the primary school that's associated with Ritsumeikan. And she talked about meeting with Joe as a PhD student and being so scared of this. And Joe was physically a large man. So he really took up a lot of space when you were in his office or his living room. And for her to sit next to him and feel that she was, at the beginning of a career and new to the United States, and she had expressed to him she really wanted to change her dissertation topic and was terrified. And had also shared with him that she was just so struggling with her language and feeling very intimidated to share without perfect English. And he had said to her, I am not here for your English language. I'm here to understand your ideas and to learn from you and to you know more about, the context in Japan than I do. Like, share that with me. And just the confidence that gave her in moving forward. And she reflects on that. And I think that it made us all smile because we had all had similar interactions with him. And I think that approach that he took, what are the differences that actually make a difference? And which ones are bringing good things? Which ones might need to be interrogated a little bit so you can come closer to a meaningful interaction? He was so committed to that. And the writing shows it, and people writing about him, I think, really comes through as well.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. Now, one last question. How are the relative costs of higher education impacting internationalization? You know that cost in higher ed is very, very critical right now. And how does that impact internationalization?
And I'm going to let you talk a little bit more about some of the university pays. Because we didn't talk so much about research, I think I can bring my department thrives on, external funding for its survival. And so the one thing that I would say that the tremendous shift that we've seen is just that for those of us who are doing research in the global space, increased competition, which is bizarrely, you're awarded for collaborating with others and in a global project, and yet there is deep competition to be able to do that. And I think that mindset is getting more and more intense as resources get more and more constrained. We are hearing from global partners that, of course, the economies in certain places are making certain activities absolutely impossible without funding. And that also creates some pretty imbalanced structures, I think, for those of us who are doing global research. And the costs that are associated in public higher education, I can only speak to what we're doing right now. We pass on those costs to every research site and everything that we dream up doing, right? And so the money is going into places sometimes that is more local than the intent of creating the global partnership. And I think that is something that is hugely, hugely problematic. And those of us who sit looking at budget spreadsheets, it's a very real thing on the daily, and it's bearing down on the nature of those partnerships and the ability to show up as equitable partners. And I think that's we're going to see a lot of loss out of that because it's not the optimal environment for knowledge exchange. And I think that's a problem. I think here closer to campus, Anne, you probably have a much better sense of some of the economics here.
I mean, I think everyone who's listening, can relate to the higher costs of higher education and, frankly, the increased expectations of people, parents, students alike. And as there's more and more expectations and more experiential learning and more advising and more international experience, more diverse experiences, all of that contributes to more cost. I'm reminded when, frankly, again, Joe was alive, that was always an issue. It wasn't as if he had a large budget or anything. And so I'm always reminded of the way he approached things, which was creatively and never letting up on anything. And this is the time really to employ systems approach. And when I say that, I mean, we are having conversations across all of our institutions about how internationalization helps to advance other very important causes and topics, such as diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, and social justice, and economic development. I work with a lot of multinational corporate leaders who need graduates who can have a global perspective, who can navigate effectively across difference, who can deal with ambiguity. And so we have this expectation in our community, as parents, as students, that we must have this training, yet we really don't want to pay for it, and it does cost money. It reminds me of the context, not only seeing the trees in the forest, but also the environment and everything else that grows there. And that's how Joe really lived his life and drove those conversations with a variety of people, being more intentional about engaging people from your community, engaging people across geographies and learning from one another about, well, how are you handling this? This isn't just a US issue. This is also an issue in Japan. It's also an issue in China. The geopolitics of everything connecting all of us. So to come together to really talk about that. So I'm not giving a solution per se, but I'm explaining, I think, how Joe saw it and never let up. And looking at international education as the best place, really seeing it as an interdiscipline. So both theory and practice. We have scholars, we have practitioners, and we have scholar practitioners. And the multidimensionality of international education, it's a model for connecting the disciplines without melting them into one discipline. And so where there may be resources over here, there aren't any over here. And then that very important mission to have education for all and have access for all. And I think this book really gives some various models and frameworks to think about it. We also incorporated, and we felt strongly about, putting questions at the end of each of the chapters just as a springboard for conversation and to encourage each and every one of you to take a chapter that resonates with you and get together with your colleagues or your neighbors or whoever in your community and have a conversation. Because from that comes new thought and that inclusivity and impact, in my opinion. And maybe that sounds a little too strategic, but that genuinely is how we are trying to lead through all that we're navigating right now and also be future forward about it. AI is here and more to come. So rather than be afraid of it, embrace it. And how is it going to advance us? We will save costs, and it will also cost more money. So things to come. But I think it's an exciting and hopeful future.
Well, AI is an issue to certainly be explored more. Now, thank you for answering all of these. You have answered the questions I received, and you have given us a wonderful, wonderful exploration of that book that's out. Thank you for joining us very, very much.
Thank
Bye.
you, Margaret.
Thank you.